The consistent drone of the fluorescent lights in Warden Miller's office, usually a familiar lullaby to his endless paperwork, and the measured cadence of prison life, seemed today to sharpen the silence. Quiet whispers, filtering from the hallways, felt amplified, intrusive, a relentless drip eroding his peace. Miller sank deeper into his worn leather chair, its springs protesting with a familiar groan, and steepled his fingers, watching dust motes dance in a sliver of afternoon sun. This mundane ballet did little to quell his growing unease. It had begun subtly. A new guard's offhand comment about the chapel being surprisingly popular, followed by a veteran officer's cynical remark about inmates suddenly finding God. Miller typically dismissed such observations. He believed in redemption, even behind bars. But these whispers, they weren't about piety. They hinted at something hushed, underhanded. The knowing glances exchanged between officers when the chapel was mentioned, the sudden lulls in conversation as he approached. It was the faint, unmistakable scent of rot beneath the surface, a smell he knew intimately from years of battling deceit. He retrieved a small, leather-bound notebook from his desk, its pages filled with neat, precise script. Flipping to the entries for inmate religious services, he noted the steady, almost imperceptible rise in attendance over months, a trend he'd initially attributed to new spiritual guidance programs. But the last few weeks revealed a distinct spike, a sudden surge defying any logical explanation. It wasn't a gentle incline. It was an abrupt, almost desperate hunger for chapel time, particularly among those who'd previously shown no interest beyond their cell walls. And it wasn't confined to one faith. It was an ecumenical awakening that struck Miller as profoundly unnatural. The chapel, a stoic brick edifice separate from the main cell blocks, was designed as a sanctuary. Its stained glass windows, abstract swirls of color rather than religious figures, cast muted, shifting patterns on polished wooden pews. Today, late afternoon light filtered through, painting the worn wood in amber and rose. Miller stood at the back, just inside the heavy oak doors, largely unnoticed by the gathered inmates. On the surface, the scene was unremarkable. A volunteer pastor, his voice gentle and resonant, spoke from the pulpit. A dozen men sat in the pews, some heads bowed, others staring blankly ahead. Yet Miller's keen eye caught the subtle divergences. Far more men than usual, perhaps double the typical Sunday attendance, filled the space. And it wasn't just their numbers, it was their composition. Men from rival gangs, usually separated by an invisible but potent barrier, sat in surprisingly close proximity, some even sharing hymnals. A known enforcer for the Iron Skulls, his face usually a permanent sneer, sat with eyes closed, a faint, almost beatific smile playing on his lips. Across the aisle, a member of the rival Black Vipers, notorious for his volatile temper, appeared unusually subdued, his gaze fixed on the pastor with an intensity that felt less like devotion and more like calculation. Miller observed them for a long moment, allowing the murmurs of the service to wash over him. He noticed a few men subtly exchanging glances, not the shared understanding of faith, but quick, almost imperceptible signals. One inmate, a skinny kid known for smuggling contraband, repeatedly adjusted his jacket, his hand brushing an inner pocket. Another, a burly lifer, sat unusually upright, his eyes darting around the room, less worshiper and more sentinel. The air in the chapel, usually thick with quiet reverence, felt charged with a different energy today, a latent tension, a suppressed urgency. He slipped out as silently as he'd entered, the heavy door closing with a soft thud that seemed to absorb the chapel's muted sounds. Walking back to his office, his mind raced, weaving disparate threads together. The whispers, the attendant's spike, the unusual groupings, all coalesced into a single, disturbing hypothesis. Later that afternoon, Miller summoned Officer Ben Carter. Ben was a good officer, loyal and earnest, with a sharp eye for detail, though sometimes a touch too eager. He stood ramrod straight before Miller's desk, cap held respectfully. "Ben, close the door." Miller's voice was low. Ben complied, the click of the latch echoing. He turned, a slight furrow of concern creasing his brow. "Warden, everything all right?" Miller gestured to the chair opposite. "Have a seat, Ben. I need your honest assessment." Ben perched on the edge, still rigid. "Of course, Warden." "Tell me, what have you observed regarding the chapel attendance lately?" Miller watched Ben's face for any telltale signs. Ben shifted, a slight frown forming. "Well, sir, it's different. Definitely more crowded, especially the Sunday services, and the weeknight ones too." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I've noticed a lot of guys who never showed an ounce of interest in anything spiritual suddenly turning up, even some of the more hardened types." "Hardened types?" Miller prompted, leaning forward. "Yes, sir. Like Thorne, the big one from C Block, always causing trouble. He's been there every Sunday for the past month. And that new kid, Sanchez, who just got transferred in, he's been a regular too. Never heard of him being religious before." Ben's eyes met Miller's, a flicker of understanding passing between them. "It's not just the numbers, Warden. It's the atmosphere. It feels different, tense almost, like they're all there, but not for the same reasons as before." "You felt it too," Miller stated, not a question. Ben nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. I've tried to put my finger on it. It's not reverence, not really. It's more like an obligation, or a meeting. And the way they look at each other sometimes, when they think no one's watching. It's not the look of shared faith, Warden. It's something else. Something clandestine." Miller leaned back again, a muscle twitching in his jaw. "Clandestine. That's the word I was looking for, Ben. Something is happening in that chapel. Something beyond the sermon and the hymns." The idea of a sacred space being defiled, twisted for illicit purposes, truly disturbed him. It wasn't just a breach of rules. It was a perversion of trust, an insult to the very concept of sanctuary. "What do you think, Warden?" Ben asked, his voice hushed, a hint of apprehension in his tone. "I think," Miller said, his gaze fixed on a distant point beyond the walls, "that our chapel has become a convenient cover, and we need to find out for what." The quiet whispers were no longer just whispers. They were growing louder, demanding action. The flimsy note. The fluorescent lights of the administrative hallway hummed, a stark contrast to the muted stained glass glow of the chapel. Warden Miller sat at his desk, the silence of his office punctuated only by the distant clang of a cell door. He was reviewing incident reports, but his mind kept drifting back to the persistent whispers about the chapel. Then, a hesitant knock echoed. "Come in," Miller called, his voice calm despite the prickle of unease he'd been feeling. A young officer, no older than 25, entered. His name tag read, Officer Davies, and his hands were clasped tightly behind his back, a clear sign of nervousness. He kept his gaze fixed on a point just above Miller's left shoulder. "Warden Miller, sir," Davies began, his voice a little shaky. I think I saw something." Miller leaned back, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Go on, Officer Davies. Take a breath. What did you see?" Davies swallowed hard. "It was during the evening service, sir. Last night. I was stationed at the back, near the entrance. The usual crowd was there, you know. The ones who suddenly found religion." He gave a short, humorless chuckle. "Anyway, during the hymn, when everyone was standing, I saw it. A piece of paper, folded small." Miller's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Where did you see this paper, officer?" "It was passed from one inmate to another, sir. From Marcus the Serpent Thorn to that new recruit of his, Silas Shank Jenkins. Very quick, very subtle. But I saw it. Thorn had it in his palm, then a quick brush of hands, and it was gone into Jenkins's pocket. They thought no one was watching, but I was." Davis's voice gained a touch of pride, though his hands remained clasped behind his back, betraying his underlying apprehension. A small, flimsy piece of paper. The seemingly innocuous detail solidified Miller's growing suspicion into a chilling certainty. This wasn't just inmates finding faith. It was a brazen, organized operation unfolding right under their noses, using the sanctity of the chapel as its camouflage. The sacrilege of it gnawed at him. "Thank you, Officer Davies," Miller said, his voice now a low, steady rumble. "You did well to report this. Your observation is invaluable." He watched as a flicker of relief crossed Davies' face. "Keep your eyes open, but keep your counsel. We don't want to tip our hand just yet." As Davies exited, the door clicking shut behind him, Miller rose and moved to his window, looking out over the gray expanse of the prison yard. The setting sun cast long shadows, painting the scene in a muted palette of orange and bruised purple. He thought of Officer Carter, his earnest loyalty, and his own earlier unease. It was time to bring Carter fully into the fold. He picked up the internal phone and dialed Carter's extension. "Officer Carter, can you report to my office, please?" "Immediately." Within minutes, Carter was knocking, his brow furrowed with curiosity. "Warden? Everything all right?" Miller motioned for him to sit. "Ben, I've had a development. A new guard, Officer Davies, just reported seeing a folded note passed in the chapel last night, from Thorn to Jenkins." Carter's eyes widened. "A note? In the chapel? So it's not just talk, then. They're really communicating." "More than just communicating, I fear," Miller said, his gaze fixed on Carter. "This confirms what we both suspected. The sudden surge in attendance, the odd gatherings. It's a cover. A very effective one, if not for vigilant officers like Davies and yourself." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to an almost conspiratorial whisper. "Ben, this is serious. A clandestine operation within the chapel. Think about what that implies. Not just small-time contraband. Rival gangs, working together, passing notes. This points to something far more significant. Coordination, planning. It could be anything from orchestrating trouble within these walls to running operations on the outside, using this prison as a command center." Carter's usual eagerness was tempered by a visible flicker of apprehension. "An outside connection? You think it's that big, Warden?" "I have a gut feeling, Ben, and my gut rarely lies. A sacred space, twisted and used for nefarious purposes. That level of desecration, that audacity. It suggests high stakes. They wouldn't risk this for petty squabbles. This is about power, influence, and likely significant criminal enterprise." Miller's jaw was set, a grim line. "We need to be discreet, Ben. Extremely discreet. We can't afford for them to know we're onto them." "Not yet." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "I need you to start compiling a list of all inmates who attend the chapel services regularly, especially those who've shown a sudden interest. Pay close attention to who sits near whom, who exchanges glances. Anything out of the ordinary, no matter how small. And from now on, any officer assigned to chapel duty is to report directly to you with their observations, and you, in turn, report directly to me. No one else. Carter nodded, his expression now a mix of resolve and a growing sense of gravity. Understood, Warden. I'll start immediately. As Carter left, Miller returned to his window. The last vestiges of daylight were fading, plunging the yard into deepening shadows. A cold knot formed in his stomach. The flimsy note. It was just a small scrap of paper, but it held the potential to unravel a darkness far greater than any he had anticipated. Silent eyes. The heavy oak door of Miller's office clicked shut, the sound swallowed by the thick carpet. Officer Ben Carter stood a little too stiffly before the warden's desk, hands clasped behind his back. The air hummed with a quiet intensity, a reflection of the man seated opposite him. Miller, usually a man of few words, leaned forward, his gaze fixed on Ben. "Carter," Miller began, his voice a low rumble, "you're a good man. Sharp. Dependable." Ben's chest puffed out almost imperceptibly, "which is why I need your absolute discretion and your steady hand for what comes next." Miller pushed a small, velvet-lined box across the desk. Ben, hesitant, opened it. Inside, nestled in the dark fabric, were three objects no larger than a thumbnail. Each had a minuscule lens glinting under the desk lamp. They looked like polished black pebbles, innocuous, yet unnervingly potent. "These are our new eyes," Miller explained, his finger tracing the edge of one. "High definition, sound sensitive, wireless. They'll stream directly to a secure feed I've established. No one, absolutely no one, is to know about them. Not Davies, not even the chaplain." Ben picked one up, turning it over in his fingers. It felt impossibly light, like a shard of obsidian. "Sir, what exactly are we looking for?" "Proof," Miller stated, his jaw tightening. "Proof that our chapel, a place meant for solace and reflection, has been desecrated by those who seek to use it for their own dark purposes." Davies saw Thorne pass a note to Jenkins. "That's just the tip of a very cold, very dirty iceberg. I suspect something far grander, far more organized is brewing. And it's not just inside these walls." Ben swallowed, the implications settling heavily. "Understood, Warden. Where do we put them?" Miller unrolled a blueprint of the chapel, his finger tapping various points. "Here, here, and here." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "The confessional booth, specifically under the kneeler, facing the grill. The underside of the lectern, angled towards the congregation, and the most challenging. The cross itself, at the very top, nestled within a shadowed crevice of the wood carving, looking down on everything." He looked up, his eyes meeting Ben's. "They must be invisible, Carter. No glint, no shadow, no trace. We'll go in tonight after the last patrol sweep. You'll handle the installation. I'll handle the cover." Hours later, the prison was a symphony of muffled snores and the occasional distant clang. A sliver of moonlight, filtered through high, barred windows, painted the chapel aisle in shades of gray. Miller stood sentinel at the chapel door, a heavy set of keys jangling softly in his hand, his ears straining for any sound that wasn't the rhythmic thrum of the building settling for the night. Inside, Ben, a small toolkit at his feet, worked with the meticulous precision of a surgeon. A tiny flashlight, barely illuminating his workspace, cast his face in stark relief. He started with the confessional. The wooden kneeler was old, worn smooth by countless penitents, Ben carefully pried open a small, almost invisible crack in the underside, just enough to embed the camera. He used a dab of dark, putty-like adhesive, molding it perfectly around the device until it was flush with the wood, indistinguishable from a natural blemish. He tested the angle with a small, specialized viewfinder, adjusting it fraction by fraction until the grill was perfectly framed. Next, the lectern. Its robust base offered more cover. Ben worked slowly, his movements deliberate, his breathing shallow. He scraped away a tiny sliver of aged varnish, created a recess, and fitted the second camera, covering it with a thin layer of carefully matched wood filler. He smoothed it with a finger, then gently polished the area until it blended seamlessly. His nerves were a taut wire, humming with the intensity of the task. He could feel Miller's silent presence at the door, a steady anchor in the oppressive quiet. The cross was the most daunting. It dominated the altar, a towering carved oak figure. Ben carefully positioned a small foldable ladder, its rubber feet making no sound on the polished floor. He ascended slowly, each rung a silent prayer. At the top, nestled within the intricate folds of the carving, where the horizontal beam met the vertical, was a natural hollow. It was perfect. He pressed the final camera into place, securing it with the same dark adhesive, blending it into the shadowed wood grain. He descended, heart thumping a quick rhythm against his ribs. He stepped back, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow. The chapel, bathed in its muted moonlight, revealed no secrets, no glints of newly installed metal. The cameras were truly hidden. Miller stepped inside, moving with the quiet grace of a predator. He walked the aisle, his eyes sweeping over the familiar space, searching for any anomaly. He paused at the confessional, ran a hand along the underside of the kneeler. Nothing. He examined the lectern, his gaze lingering. Unremarkable. Finally, he looked up at the cross, a dark silhouette against the muted light of the stained glass window. "Well done, Carter," Miller said, his voice barely audible, note of quiet satisfaction in its depths. Truly well done. Ben exhaled, a long, slow breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He felt a profound sense of accomplishment, a quiet pride in the flawless execution. They had placed their silent eyes. Now they would wait. The chapel would soon reveal its true congregation. The first glimpse. The server rack's low thrum was Miller's sole companion as he transformed a corner of his office into a provisional surveillance hub. He'd cleared a side table, now laden with requisitioned monitors and a compact, high-powered recording unit. The air conditioning unit's faint, familiar whir offered a comforting counterpoint to the otherwise taut silence. With precise movements, he connected cables, his hands textured by years of handling tools and paperwork, working with ingrained efficiency. Screens flickered to life, casting an ethereal blue-white glow across his desk's polished surface. He adjusted his swivel chair, eyes fixed on the trio of displays. The primary monitor showed a triptych of the chapel, the confessional's shadowed interior, the underside of the lectern, revealing a mere sliver of worn carpet and the sturdy scuffed boots of a passing guard. And, finally, the subtle, almost imperceptible angle from within the altar's cross, offering a wide, if slightly warped view of the pews and the altar itself. The smaller screens rotated through individual feeds, allowing for closer scrutiny of each vantage point. The clarity was impressive. Ben had truly outdone himself. Miller leaned back, a soft sigh escaping him. He picked up his now-chilled mug, taking a slow sip of black coffee. Its bitter taste, a familiar anchor. He glanced at the wall clock. Mid-morning. The chapel's daily services had concluded hours ago. but the recorded footage provided an opportunity to review the day's activities in full. He navigated the interface with ease, scrubbing back to the start of the morning service. The initial hours proved uneventful. He watched Father Michael, the chaplain, deliver a sermon on redemption, his voice a low, resonant murmur from the lectern. Inmates occupied the pews, some engrossed, some lost in thought, others shifting restlessly. The confessional camera remained dark and still, a silent sentinel. The altar feed captured the occasional movements of altar boys, the shifting light through the stained glass windows, and the solemn rituals of the Mass. Miller's keen eyes, usually quick to spot anomalies, found nothing amiss. No furtive glances, no coded gestures, no whispered exchanges seemed out of place. The conversations he did hear were typical chapel chatter, quiet greetings, murmured prayers, and the rustle of hymnals. He fast-forwarded through segments when the chapel was empty, pausing only when someone entered or exited. Lunchtime brought a small group for a Bible study. Their discussions were earnest, sometimes animated, but consistently centered on Scripture. Miller listened intently, his brow furrowed in concentration. He recognized a few inmates, a former accountant convicted of fraud, a quiet man jailed for a nonviolent offense, and a young, troubled inmate known for his quick temper. Now seemingly subdued, their interactions were respectful, even supportive. As the afternoon waned, the chapel remained largely quiet, save for an occasional cleaner or a lone inmate seeking solitude. The confessional door stayed shut. The lectern stood vacant. The altar's cross maintained its silent vigil. Miller felt a pang of frustration, a common companion in most investigations. He knew that revealing deep-seated corruption rarely came with a single glance. It was a slow, arduous process, akin to panning for gold, sifting through mountains of sand for a single gleaming fleck. He stretched, his back protesting slightly after hours of immobility. The coffee had done little to repel the creeping weariness. He rubbed his temples, his gaze still fixed on the monitors, even as he leaned back. He had anticipated this. He hadn't expected to uncover a grand conspiracy on day one. Criminals, especially organized ones, were not so careless as to expose their operations immediately. They were cunning, patient, and deeply embedded in their environments. The idea that this sacred space, a sanctuary meant for solace and spiritual reflection, could be twisted to serve such dark purposes gnawed at him. It wasn't just a breach of prison security. It was a profound violation of trust, a desecration. He thought of Father Michael, a man whose faith seemed as unshakable as the prison's stone walls. Was he an unwitting pawn, or something far more sinister? Miller pushed the thought away, knowing speculation was dangerous. Facts, and only facts, would guide this investigation. He reviewed the timeline on the recording unit. The cameras were set for continuous recording, storing weeks of footage. He would need to develop a system, perhaps focus on specific times, certain individuals. But for now, he would watch everything. He would scrutinize every shadow, every fleeting expression, every whispered word. Miller squared his shoulders, a renewed determination hardening his features. This was merely the first glimpse. The real picture, he knew, was yet to emerge. He picked up a fresh, hot mug of coffee that his assistant had quietly placed on his desk while he was lost in thought. The warmth seeped into his hands, a small comfort. He settled back into his chair, eyes once again scanning the screens, ready for the long watch. Patience was not just a virtue in his line of work. It was a weapon, and Miller was prepared to wield it. A tap and a scratch weeks, blurred into a continuous vigil, each day a meticulous dissection of the chapel's measured pulse. Miller and Ben had fallen into a rhythm, their small room a crucible of focused scrutiny. The server rack's low thrum was an ever-present companion, a subterranean current beneath the faint hymns and rustling pages wafting from their monitors. Miller hunched over his console, a mug of tepid coffee clasped in his hand, his gaze unwavering as he scoured endless hours of uneventful footage. Beside him, Ben mirrored his posture, a notepad on his lap steadily accruing meaningless timestamps and observations. "Anything, sir?" Ben's voice, a low rasp after a long silence, broke the quiet. His eyes, though weary, still scoured the screens with an earnest intensity. Miller exhaled, a weary sigh. "Just more of the same, Ben. Devout faces, the occasional yawn. It's almost too normal." This very normalcy grated on him, a placid surface concealing unseen undertows. A familiar knot tightened in his gut. They were fast-forwarding through a particularly somber Sunday service when a fleeting, almost imperceptible flicker snagged Miller's attention. He halted the playback, rewinding a few seconds. "There," he murmured, a steady finger pointing at the screen. "Amplify that. Right side, pew 3. Ben leaned in, fingers dancing across the keyboard. The image sharpened, focusing on a man Miller recognized as Whisper Jones, a jittery inmate whose eyes perpetually darted, seeking escape routes or threats. Whisper held a hymn book, head bowed, seemingly lost in prayer. Yet something felt amiss. His fingers, resting on the open page, were moving. A subtle, rhythmic dance, almost an unconscious tick. "What's he doing?" Ben breathed, a catch in his voice. Miller's eyes narrowed, a spark igniting. "He's tapping." The movement was too precise, too deliberate for an idle fidget. One finger, then another. A brief pause, a rapid succession of taps. It wasn't random drumming, it was a code. They watched, mesmerized, as Whisper continued his silent communication. His eyes never strayed from the hymn book, his expression a mask of pious absorption, but his fingers narrated a different tale. The taps were nearly imperceptible, their sound swallowed by the chapel's acoustics, but the visual was undeniable. "He's sending a message," Ben whispered, realization blossoming. A thrill of discovery electrified the stale air of the surveillance room. Miller didn't respond, his mind racing. To whom was he communicating? The camera angle wasn't expansive enough to capture a direct recipient. He began to fast forward, then rewind, isolating Whisper's taps, attempting to decipher the rhythm, the pauses. It was a language he didn't yet comprehend, but he knew he was on the precipice of something significant. They spent another hour replaying the sequence, zooming in on every face in Whisper's vicinity. The chapel had been relatively full that day, a sea of bowed heads and clasped hands. Then, Miller saw it. In the pew directly ahead of Whisper, 2 seats to the left, sat Silas Blackwood. The Shadow, as he was known in certain circles, was a man who exuded an unsettling calm, an almost saintly demeanor that had always pricked at Miller's instincts. As Whisper's fingers performed their silent ballet, Blackwood slowly, almost languidly, raised a hand to his ear. His fingers scratched lightly behind his left lobe, then moved to his right, a gentle, deliberate motion. It appeared innocent enough, a man adjusting an itch during a lengthy sermon. But Miller's gut screamed otherwise. "Zoom in on Blackwood," Miller commanded, his voice tight with anticipation. The image sharpened, bringing Blackwood's placid face into stark relief. His eyes were closed, a faint, beatific smile playing on his lips. Yet, As Whisper's taps concluded, Blackwood's fingers paused their scratching for just a fraction of a second too long. A subtle hesitation before resuming their seemingly casual motion. It was a response, a confirmation. "He's acknowledging it," Ben exclaimed, his excitement barely contained. "The ear scratch. It's their reply." Miller leaned back, a grim satisfaction settling over him. "A tap and a scratch," he murmured, the words tasting like victory. Simple, quiet, and easily dismissed. Brilliant in its simplicity, despicable in its intent. The air in the room, once heavy with stale coffee and fruitless waiting, now crackled with the energy of a breakthrough. They had found their needle in the haystack, the first thread in a sinister tapestry. The chapel, once a beacon of spiritual solace, was indeed a conduit for something far darker. Patient observation had paid off, confirming Miller's deepest suspicions. This was merely the beginning. Hidden messages. The monitor's verdant luminescence etched stark shadows across Miller's weary features. Next to him, Ben Carter, reliably meticulous, maintained a meticulous log, his pen's faint scratching, a rhythmic counterpoint to the room's tense quiet. The surveillance chamber hung heavy with the aroma of stale coffee and unspoken apprehension. On screen, the prison chapel buzzed with its customary Sunday service. Brother Thomas, his gentle visage radiating conviction, guided the congregation in a hymn. His voice, pristine and resonant, permeated the sterile observation room, a stark auditory contrast to the dark undercurrent Miller sensed beneath the placid surface. Then, the almost imperceptible transgression occurred. The camera, cunningly positioned behind a mosaic of stained glass, offered a sweeping panorama of the pews. As the hymn faded and a collective amen resonated, a subtle tremor snaked through the front row. Whisper Jones, his gaze skittering nervously, held open a worn Bible, feigning absorption in Scripture. Yet, his slender, nimble fingers weren't tracing verses. Instead, he deftly palmed a minuscule, tightly rolled paper from between the pages of his hymnal, tucking it into the spine of his Bible. His head remained bowed, lips moving in a silent devotion, a flawless tableau of piety. A few seats away, Silas Blackwood, known as the Shadow, sat with an almost beatific expression. His hands, clasped before him, rested upon his own Bible. As Whisper's head rose, Silas's left hand subtly shifted, his thumb brushing the cover's edge. It was a nearly imperceptible gesture, a silent acknowledgement that the message had landed. "Did you catch that, Ben?" Miller's voice was a low hum, barely a whisper itself. Ben leaned closer, rewinding the feed. "The hand movement, sir. Right after Jones secreted that, whatever it was, into his Bible." He replayed it in slow motion. The exchange concluded in milliseconds. A blink and you miss it flicker. "He's confirming the drop." Miller nodded slowly, a grim satisfaction coiling in his gut. "The hymnals and Bibles. Not just for prayer, are they?" A cold knot tightened in his stomach. The desecration of a sacred space for such vile machinations felt like a personal affront. Later that week, during the Wednesday evening prayer meeting, the cameras unveiled another layer of their intricate communication. Brother Thomas, eyes closed in heartfelt devotion, led a responsive prayer. "Lord, grant us strength in our trials," he intoned. From the rear, a gruff voice belonging to a burly inmate dubbed Bulldog responded, "And guide our path through the shadows." A standard reply, seemingly innocuous. But then, Whisper Jones, seated near the front, added, "May our harvest be bountiful and our fields clear." Miller's brows furrowed. "Harvest? Fields? That's hardly typical chapel rhetoric, is it? Ben, consulting his meticulous notes, shook his head. No, sir. Brother Thomas usually adheres to broader themes: redemption, forgiveness. Harvest and fields are new. I've logged every response, and those words haven't surfaced in his usual liturgy before. As the camera zoomed, Whisper's lips moved, slightly out of sync with the usual prayer cadence. His words, though muffled, were sufficiently clear for the hypersensitive microphones. The north gate, 6 stones, midnight. Miller surged forward, his heart accelerating. Rewind that, immediately. Ben swiftly complied, isolating Whisper's response. The enhanced audio brought the murmured words into sharp focus. North gate, 6 stones, midnight. Silas Blackwood, seated directly across the aisle, bowed his head deeper, hands still clasped, but a subtle tremor ran through his right thumb. He neither spoke nor shifted, yet the message was undeniably absorbed. They're not praying, Ben, Miller stated, his voice flat with dawning revelation. They're coordinating. That's not a plea for spiritual guidance. It's an instruction for a job. A surge of cold fury coursed through him. This wasn't merely petty contraband. This was a well-oiled criminal enterprise operating brazenly under his nose, using the sanctity of faith as an impenetrable shield. The sheer audacity, the profound disrespect for everything Brother Thomas embodied, gnawed at him. Ben looked pallid. North gate, 6 stones, midnight. Sounds like a pickup, sir. Or perhaps a drop. 6 stones could denote a quantity, or even a time marker. 6 minutes past midnight, or 6 items. Or a location, Miller mused, his mind already dissecting the prison's blueprints. There's a section of the north wall, with 6 large, distinctive foundation stones near the old service road. It's a blind spot for the exterior cameras, if you know precisely where to stand. He rose, pacing the confined room. They've been at this for weeks, likely months, right in front of Brother Thomas, while he genuinely believes he's saving their souls. The thought twisted in his gut. Brother Thomas, with his guileless faith, was a mere unwitting prop in their grim theatrical. We need to identify every player, Ben, Miller commanded, his voice hardening with resolve. Every flicker, every whispered utterance, every seemingly innocent exchange. We need to construct an unassailable case. This isn't just about snaring a few inmates, it's about dismantling a network that has clearly permeated beyond these walls. He tapped the monitor, the image of Silas's serene face seeming to mock him. And we start with the shadow. He's the spider at the heart of this web. The outside connection. The small monitor flickered with the grainy, monochromatic image of the chapel at its quietest, then shifted to a scene of hushed activity. Sunday service. Miller and Ben sat hunched over the desk, the air thick with the hum of the server and the faint scent of stale coffee. Ben navigated the timeline with practiced clicks, fast-forwarding through hymns and sermons, until he reached the moments of subtle, illicit exchange. Whisper Jones, fidgeting in the third pew, leaned forward as Silas Blackwood, radiating an almost unsettling calm, rose to offer a prayer. Lord, Silas began, his voice a low, resonant hum, we pray for those beyond these walls, tending to the fields we've sown. May their hands be guided and their harvest bountiful. Miller's jaw tightened. The fields we've sown, he repeated, the words tasting like ash. Not spiritual crops, I'd wager. Later that afternoon, during what was officially designated as a fellowship hour, the footage sharpened into something more direct. Silas, now seated in a corner with Whisper, and 2 other inmates Miller recognized as enforcers from rival gangs. a burly man named Bulldog, and a wiry, scarred individual known only as Snake, spoke in low tones. Their heads were bowed, giving the impression of intense spiritual contemplation, but their lips moved with a different purpose. "The usual spot," Silas murmured, his eyes scanning the empty pews. "Southwest corner, under the old oak. Midnight. Tell them to be punctual." Whisper, nervously picking at a loose thread on his trousers, nodded almost imperceptibly. "And the package?" he whispered back, his voice barely audible above the chapel's ambient hum. Silas's gaze, usually placid, hardened for a fraction of a second. "The package is paramount. It funds the outside work. Without it, our operations falter." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Ensure the drop-off is clean. No loose ends." Ben leaned closer to the screen, his breath catching. "They're talking about actual drop-offs, Warden. Not just coded messages. This is an active smuggling ring." Miller felt a cold knot of fury tightening in his gut. The sacred space, defiled, the very essence of hope and redemption, twisted into a conduit for crime. They're not just moving contraband, Ben. They're orchestrating crimes from inside these walls. The outside work. That's external operations, directed by Silas. The next clip, from a Tuesday evening prayer meeting, cemented Miller's suspicions. Silas was addressing a larger group, his voice imbued with a preacher's fervor. "Brothers," he proclaimed, "the Lord provides. Our brethren out there are diligent. The North Gate delivery. 6 stones. It's confirmed for the coming midnight. A new shipment. Blessed by Providence." Whisper, standing slightly behind Silas, subtly adjusted his hand, counting out 6 fingers against his thigh, then traced a quick, almost imperceptible in the air. "They're giving specific instructions for a new delivery route," Ben observed, his voice tinged with disbelief. 6 stones. That has to be a landmark, or a code, for the quantity. Miller watched Silas, the man's face a mask of serene devotion, and felt a surge of pure, unadulterated anger. This wasn't just a few inmates trading favors. This was a highly organized criminal enterprise, using the veneer of religion to cloak its dark heart. Silas Blackwood, the pious prisoner, was a master manipulator, pulling strings that reached far beyond the prison walls. "He's using the chapel as his command center," Miller said, his voice low and tight. "And these deliveries aren't just small-time drug drops. The mention of funds and operations suggests something far more extensive. They're coordinating a network of crimes." Ben zoomed in on Whisper Jones, who, despite his usual jittery demeanor, was now subtly passing a small, folded piece of paper to Bulldog. The exchange was swift, almost invisible, occurring during a moment when Silas had dramatically raised his hands in prayer, drawing the attention of the few guards patrolling the periphery. "That's intel, Warden," Ben stated, his finger pointing at the screen. "Information being passed for an external job, I guarantee it." The implications were chilling. Not only were they smuggling, but they were also directing criminal activities, perhaps even planning escapes, all under the noses of the prison staff. The thought of what they might be planning next, what havoc they might unleash outside, settled heavily in Miller's chest. He leaned back, rubbing his temples. "We need to know the full extent of this. Every name, every location, every drop-off. We're not just busting a smuggling ring, Ben. We're dismantling a criminal empire operating from within my prison." The resolve in Miller's eyes was clear. The quiet, observant warden was gone, replaced by a man fueled by righteous indignation. He would not allow the sacred space of the chapel, meant for solace and spiritual growth, to remain a den of thieves and conspirators. This network, with Silas Blackwood at its insidious core, would be exposed and every thread of its dark tapestry unraveled. The surveillance would continue, relentless and unforgiving, until every outside connection was severed. Escape plans. The grainy footage flickered, illuminating the tense faces of Warden Miller and Officer Ben Carter in the dimly lit surveillance room. The hum of the equipment was the only sound, a stark counterpoint to the hushed voices emanating from the speakers. This wasn't just about smuggled goods anymore. The latest recordings from the chapel had taken a far more sinister turn. Silas Blackwood, ever the picture of serene contemplation, stood before a small group of inmates, his voice a low, reassuring murmur. But the words, decoded by Ben's tireless work, spoke of anything but spiritual peace. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," Silas began, his gaze sweeping over the gathered men, lingering a moment on Whisper Jones, whose eyes darted around the room with habitual unease. "And sometimes, brothers, he provides us with new garments for our journey." Ben leaned forward, his finger hovering over the pause button. "New garments," he whispered, a tremor in his voice. "That's what they called them. Not money, not packages. Miller, this is different." Miller nodded slowly, his jaw tight. He remembered the earlier references, dismissed then as part of the smuggling jargon, but now, coupled with other intercepted fragments, it clicked into place with horrifying clarity. "Play it," he instructed, his voice a low rumble. The recording continued. Whisper Jones, looking more agitated than usual, shifted his weight. "But the fit, Silas," he murmured, barely audible above the chapel's ambient sounds. "It has to be right. No room for error. The outside, it's a long way." Silas offered a beatific smile, a gesture that now sent a chill down Miller's spine. "Fear not, brother. The tailor is meticulous. He understands the measurements. He knows exactly what we need for the path ahead." His eyes flickered towards the back wall, a seemingly innocuous glance that Miller now knew was anything but. Then came the most damning fragment, a snippet of conversation between Whisper and another inmate, Bulldog, caught moments later, near the chapel's rarely used storage closet. "Is the path clear, Whisper?" Bulldog grunted, his voice a low growl. "The one Silas spoke of. The one beneath the stones." Whisper wrung his hands. "Almost. The digging is slow, Bulldog. And the noise. We need the services to mask it, especially when we get to the foundations. Oh, that's where the real work begins. We can't afford any slips, not with the light at the end." Ben gasped, a sharp intake of breath. "The tunnel," he breathed, his eyes wide with disbelief. He rewinded a few seconds, playing the exchange again. "Beneath the stones, the foundations, the light at the end." His gaze met Miller's, a silent question hanging in the air. Miller felt a cold dread settle deep in his gut. The new clothes weren't just a metaphor for freedom. They were literal changes of attire for men on the run. The tunnel wasn't a coded reference to a hidden pathway for goods, but a physical means of escape. His chapel, his sacred space, was not only a hub for a criminal empire, but also the launch pad for a prison break. He leaned back in his chair, the squeak of the worn leather echoing in the silence. The weight of this revelation was immense. His initial suspicions about unusual activity had spiraled into something far beyond a simple smuggling ring. This was a sophisticated, multi-layered operation, meticulously planned and executed right under their noses. Silas Blackwood wasn't just a cunning inmate. He was a master strategist, leveraging the very structure of the prison against itself. "The urgency has just escalated tenfold, Ben," Miller said, his voice quiet but firm, betraying none of the turmoil churning within him. "They're not just moving product, they're moving themselves. And if they succeed, it won't just be a few criminals on the loose. It will expose the entire institution to ridicule, compromise safety, and potentially incite chaos." Ben nodded, his face pale. "So what now, Warden? We can't just let them finish the tunnel. We have to act." Miller's gaze returned to the frozen image of Silas Blackwood on the screen, his face a mask of false piety. He understood now the full scope of the danger, the audacious scale of Blackwood's ambition. The man wasn't merely orchestrating crimes from behind bars. He was planning to walk right out the front door, or rather, from under the chapel's very foundation. "We act, Ben," Miller affirmed, pushing himself up from his chair. The room felt smaller now, charged with the sudden, pressing need for decisive action. "But we act smart. We need to know the full extent of this tunnel, the exact timing of their journey. We need to catch them red-handed, not just to prevent an escape, but to dismantle this entire network. Every piece of this puzzle has to fall into place." The chapel, once a symbol of solace, had become a crucible of deceit, and Warden Miller knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he was standing on the precipice of a confrontation that would define his career, and perhaps the fate of the entire prison. The game was no longer just about uncovering a crime. It was about preventing a catastrophe. The raid. The fluorescent lights of the police precinct's conference room hummed, casting a stark glow on the faces gathered around the monitor. Warden Miller, his expression a tight mask of controlled urgency, clicked play. The screen flickered to life, showing grainy, time-stamped footage of the chapel's interior. Officer Carter stood beside him, a nervous energy radiating from his usually calm demeanor. Across the table, Police Chief Randall, a man whose weary eyes had seen too much, leaned forward, his initial skepticism giving way to a grim fascination. The first few minutes showed Brother Thomas leading a genuine, if somewhat subdued, service. But then the camera subtly zoomed, following the entrance of Silas Blackwood. The inmate, usually so poised, moved with an almost imperceptible shift in his gait as he approached the altar. Miller narrated, his voice low and steady, pointing out the coded hand gestures, the seemingly innocuous phrases that, when cross-referenced with later footage, revealed their sinister intent. Chief Randall watched, his jaw tightening as the evidence mounted. He saw Silas, during a moment of communal prayer, slip a small, folded note into Brother Thomas's hymnal. A note later intercepted and deciphered to contain instructions for a drop-off point outside the prison. He saw Whisper Jones, eyes darting nervously around the room, surreptitiously pass a miniature, crudely drawn map to another inmate during the offertory. The chief's gaze sharpened when the footage shifted to a different angle, revealing a small, almost invisible crack in the chapel's stone floor, strategically hidden beneath a worn prayer mat. Then came the infrared shots, taken at night, showing the faint heat signatures of men working beneath the chapel, their movements slow and deliberate. "The new garments they discussed?" Miller's voice cut through the silence. "Escape attire. The path beneath the stones. A literal tunnel. This isn't just a ring, Chief. It's an entire enterprise. Smuggling, external coordination, and now an imminent escape." The chief stared at the screen, a muscle twitching in his cheek. Disbelief warred with the undeniable visual proof. "Good God," he muttered, shaking his head, Right under our noses, a chapel, of all places. He looked up, meeting Miller's unwavering gaze. "What's the plan, Warden?" Miller laid out the strategy, concise and direct. "We hit them during their next service. It's when they're all assembled, their guards slightly down. Silas needs to be caught in the act, undeniable. We go in hard, fast, and without warning." A few hours later, the chapel hummed with the familiar cadence of Brother Thomas's sermon. The afternoon sun filtered through stained glass windows, cast colorful patterns across the worn pews. Silas Blackwood sat in his usual spot, front row, eyes closed in what appeared to be profound contemplation. His outward calm was a practiced art, a shield against suspicion. Whisper Jones, a few rows back, fidgeted, his gaze straying to the heavy wooden doors more often than not. He felt a prickle of unease, an indefinable sense of impending change. Brother Thomas, gentle and earnest, spoke of redemption and second chances, his voice echoing softly in the sacred space. He noticed a slight stiffness in Silas today, a subtle tension in his shoulders that wasn't usually there, but attributed it to the weight of his spiritual burdens. Suddenly, the chapel doors burst open with a resounding thwack, shattering the serene atmosphere. The sound was like a thunderclap in the quiet room. A squad of armed police officers, led by Chief Randall and Warden Miller, flooded the aisle. Their tactical gear and stern faces were a stark contrast to the colorful light streaming through the windows. "Freeze! Everyone down on the ground!" Chief Randall's voice boomed, amplified by the sudden silence. Chaos erupted. Inmates gasped. Some screamed. Others instinctively ducked. Brother Thomas, midway through a scripture, froze, his face pale with shock. Silas Blackwood, for the first time in Miller's observation, showed a flicker of surprise. His eyes, usually so placid, widened for a split second before regaining their composure. He remained seated, his hands clasped, a picture of bewildered innocence amidst the pandemonium. "Silas Blackwood," an officer shouted, pointing directly at him. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, smuggling, and attempted escape." Before Silas could utter a word, 2 officers were on him, pulling his hands behind his back. The handcuffs clicked shut with a chilling finality. He offered no resistance, his face a mask of serene defiance, as if this were merely another trial to be endured. Whisper Jones, however, was a different story. His eyes wild with panic, he made a desperate lunge for the nearest exit, only to be tackled by a burly officer. "No! I didn't do anything! It wasn't me!" he shrieked, struggling against the iron grip. Warden Miller watched the scene unfold, a grim satisfaction settling in his chest. Officer Carter moved swiftly, directing other officers to secure key individuals identified from the surveillance footage. The air crackled with tension, the sounds of cuffing and shouted commands replacing the hymns. The sacred space, so long desecrated by deceit, was finally being purged. The raid was swift, decisive, and brutally effective. The network was exposed, its leaders apprehended. The silence that slowly descended upon the chapel as the last of the implicated inmates were led away was not peaceful, but the heavy quiet of justice served. A safer place. The clatter of tools and the low murmur of voices had replaced the hushed solemnity of chapel services. For weeks following the arrests, the chapel was a hive of activity, not of worship, but of reconstruction and reevaluation. Every crevice was scrutinized, every floorboard lifted, and every wall tapped. The meticulous search had yielded more than just the tunnel. Hidden compartments beneath the altar, false bottoms in collection plates, and even hollowed-out hymn books were discovered, each a testament to Blackwood's chilling ingenuity. Warden Miller watched from the observation window of his office, a quiet satisfaction settling over him. The orange jumpsuit of a demolition crew member flashed as he wrestled with a stubborn pew, pulling it free from its anchors. The very air of the chapel, once tainted by a pervasive unseen corruption, felt lighter, scrubbed clean by the honest labor of men committed to its true purpose. The overhaul of the religious program protocols was extensive, touching every aspect of inmate interaction and chapel attendance. Now, all religious materials, Bibles, hymnals, prayer rugs, were centrally issued and inspected before and after each service. Donation boxes, once a conduit for clandestine messages and smuggled goods, were replaced with clear, tamper-proof receptacles, emptied immediately by 2 rotating officers. Volunteer chaplains, previously screened only for their religious bona fides, now underwent rigorous background checks and mandatory training sessions on security protocols and contraband identification. The casual fraternization between inmates and external visitors, a critical component of Blackwood's network, was strictly curtailed, replaced by supervised, timed interactions within designated visiting areas, far from the chapel's newly fortified walls. Officer Ben Carter, typically an early riser, found himself arriving even earlier these days. He'd check the newly installed high-resolution cameras in the chapel, the feeds crisp and clear on the monitors in the security office. No more dead zones, no more inexplicable glitches. He'd personally overseen the installation of pressure plates beneath the relayed flooring, sensitive enough to detect even the slightest shift in weight outside of designated pathways. The sense of unease that had permeated the prison for months had dissipated, replaced by a quiet confidence. He saw it in the relaxed shoulders of his colleagues, the steadier pace of their patrols, the easy camaraderie in the staff mess hall. The prison, once a porous sieve, was becoming a fortress again, not just of walls and bars, but of renewed vigilance and trust. One afternoon, Ben found Warden Miller in the newly renovated chapel, running a gloved hand over the smooth, unblemished surface of a refurbished pew. The scent of fresh varnish mingled with the faint, lingering aroma of disinfectant. "Looks different, doesn't it, sir?" Ben offered, his voice echoing slightly in the vast, still space. Miller nodded, his gaze sweeping across the rows of gleaming wood. "It does, Carter. It looks honest." He paused, then turned to Ben, a rare, soft smile touching his lips. "You've been instrumental in all this, Ben. Your attention to detail, your dedication. It's made a significant difference." Ben felt a flush of pride warm his cheeks. "Just doing my job, Warden. But honestly, it feels good, knowing we've closed those gaps, that we've made this place truly safe again." "Safer, Ben," Miller corrected gently. "Always safer. Never truly safe. Complacency is the greatest enemy within these walls." He walked to the altar, now stripped of its ornate, hiding-place-laden carvings, replaced by a simple, unadorned stone slab. To think. A place meant for spiritual solace, for redemption, twisted into a hub of criminal enterprise. A shadow crossed his face, a fleeting glimpse of the disturbance Blackwood's betrayal had wrought. It was a profound violation, not just of security, but of faith. "But we stopped it, sir," Ben said, stepping closer. "Thanks to you. No one else even suspected." Miller's gaze drifted to the high, arched windows, now reinforced with shatterproof glass and intricate, unbreachable grills. "Suspicion is the seed of truth, Ben. It was there, festering. I just had to cultivate it." He exhaled slowly, a deep, cleansing breath. "The integrity of this institution, it's paramount," and Blackwood threatened it at its very core. The warden ran through the new protocols in his mind. Mandatory frisking upon entry and exit for all chapel attendees, designated observation officers for every service, even a newly installed sound dampening system to prevent coded whispers from carrying. The subtle hum of the new ventilation system was the only sound now, a stark contrast to the clandestine rustlings and hushed exchanges that had once characterized the space. The security footage from the hidden cameras played on a continuous loop in a dedicated monitor in his office. A constant reminder, a silent promise of vigilance. Later that evening, in the quiet solitude of his office, Miller reviewed the official reports. Silas Blackwood, Whisper Jones, and the others were in solitary confinement, awaiting transfer to maximum security facilities. The external network had crumbled, its various tentacles severed by the coordinated raids. The prison was no longer just a collection of cells and corridors. It was a testament to resilience, a place where order had been meticulously restored. Miller leaned back in his chair, the weight of the past few months easing from his shoulders. He had stared into the abyss of institutional corruption and pulled his prison back from the brink. The sacred space, once desecrated, was now truly a safer place. The quiet hum of the prison at night, once a source of underlying anxiety, now offered a comforting rhythm, the sound of order, diligently maintained. He had protected his prison, its integrity, and, perhaps most importantly, the trust of those who served within its walls.